Let's dive right into this explainer on the ultimate archaeological cold case, how exactly an entire hemisphere got populated, and why the story we thought we knew is currently changing at breakneck speed. You see, for decades, the timeline of human arrival in North and South America seemed totally settled. But, as we're going to see, science is a living, breathing process, and new discoveries are literally rewriting our understanding of human history.
For the longest time, the origins of the first Americans felt like a closed book. The kind of stuff we all learned in grade school, right? But what happens when undeniable physical evidence starts popping up that completely shatters that neat, established timeline? Well, let's find out.
Part 1. The Clovis First Consensus, the established truth of the 20th century.
Okay, so to set the stage, we have to talk about Beringia. During the last glacial maximum, massive amounts of the Earth's water were locked up in glacier ice. This caused global sea levels to drop by somewhere between 60 and 120 meters. That massive drop exposed Beringia. Now, don't picture a narrow little crossing. This was a vast, durable land bridge connecting Siberia and Alaska. It was a massive landscape where the very first humans actually crossed over from Asia into the Americas.
Because of this, the prevailing model for a really long time was what we call Clovis first. This theory posited that humans arrived between 13,250 and 12,800 years ago. The general idea was that these early hunter-gatherers basically followed herds of now-extinct megafauna, like your woolly mammoths, across Beringia and down through this ice-free inland corridor into North America. They were identified by these highly distinctive spear points known as Clovis points, which were first discovered in New Mexico. So case closed, right? Well, actually, scratch that. Not exactly.
Part 2. Pushing back the timeline. Disruptive anomalies shatter the consensus.
So we start with our baseline, those Clovis points sitting at around 13,000 years ago. But then, look at what happens. Up in Paisley Caves in Oregon, scientists found fossilized human feces dating back 14,300 years. Then, way farther south, all the way down in Monteverde, Chile, they found evidence of human settlement 14,500 years ago. And it doesn't stop there. Down at the Buttermill Creek Complex in Texas, stone tool fragments date back a staggering 15,500 years. Site by site, piece by piece, the timeline of human arrival was aggressively pushed backwards.
So the absolutely crucial point here is this. If humans were already hanging out all the way down in Chile 14,500 years ago, they must have entered the Americas long before that. This single question has sparked some of the most intense and, frankly, fascinating research of the 21st century. Just how far back does our story actually go?
Well, this number represents an absolute bombshell. At White Sands National Park in New Mexico, researchers discovered roughly 60 fossilized human footprints buried in layers of gypsum soil. By radiocarbon dating the seeds of aquatic plants found in the soil layers right above and below these footprints, they dated them to between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. No way, right? This puts human beings in North America right in the absolute literal middle of the last glacial maximum. Part 3. The Coastal Migration Route. Finding a new way south.
So if humans were walking around New Mexico 23,000 years ago, they had a pretty massive logistical problem. At that time, gigantic ice sheets had completely blocked the traditional inland path. That old way of thinking, the inland ice-free corridor, was completely blocked by a solid wall of ice. It was just barren glacial outwash. But enter the new prevailing theory, the Pacific Coastal Route. Even during the peak of the Ice Age, there were unglaciated coastal refugia at sea level. Early humans could have migrated down the coast, probably using boats, and survived on the highly productive, biologically rich marine life of what's sometimes called the Kelp Highway. It's almost like a prehistoric coastal road trip.
Part 4. Clues in the DNA. Modern genetic forensics solve ancient mysteries.
You know, rocks and bones only tell part of the story. To really solve this cold case, we've had to turn DNA into a kind of biological time machine. We aren't just staring at the shapes of spearheads anymore. We're using high-tech stuff like optically stimulated luminescence to literally date the quartz grains inside those footprints. We're even sequencing ancient megafaunal DNA. Think about that. By tracing genetic bottlenecks in ancient bison or carbon dating gray wolf remains pulled from the Alaskan permafrost, scientists can actually track the migratory paths and timelines that those early human hunters would have followed. It's wild.
And by looking at ancient genomes, like an infant found at the Upward Sun River site up in Alaska, geneticists have pinpointed exactly who these early pioneers were. The ancestral Native American lineage is basically a mix. It was formed roughly 20,000 to 25,000 years ago by a combination of about 65% ancient East Asian lineage and 35% ancient North Eurasian lineage.
So how did that DNA actually spread? It basically happened in three main steps. First, you have populations migrating into the Beringia land bridge. Second, you have a phase scientists called the Beringian standstill. For thousands of years, these populations were totally genetically isolated up in the harsh, freezing environment of Beringia, which allowed them to form a distinct genetic group. And then comes the third step. Between 14,500 and 17,000 years ago, as those massive glaciers finally began to retreat, this isolated population divided into two main lineages and rapidly expanded southward, fanning out all across the Americas.
Part 5. An evolving human story. Science is a living, breathing process.
Now, it's absolutely vital to remember that archaeology is all about interpreting evidence, and honestly, many highly respected academics still dispute these older, pre-glacial maximum dates. For instance, some argue that those white sands footprints might be totally skewed by something called the hard water effect, where aquatic plants absorb much older carbon from the surrounding water. And as skeptics rightly point out, if humans were really here 20,000 years ago, we should be seeing massive, completely undisputed layers of tools and artifacts. But you know what? This kind of rigorous academic friction is exactly how the scientific method tests theories to ultimately find the truth.
And that brings us to why proving the coastal migration theory is so incredibly frustrating and difficult. Since the end of the Ice Age, global sea levels have risen by up to 100 meters. Let that sink in. That means if the very first Americans did travel down the Pacific coast in boats, camping on ancient beaches and foraging in kelp forests 20,000 years ago, the physical evidence of their incredible journey is quite literally sitting at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean.
Which leaves us with this final thought. We've gone from a super rigid 13,000-year-old timeline to suddenly discovering footprints that might be 23,000 years old. We're actively using genetics and the DNA of long-dead bison to trace invisible paths across submerged continents. The story of the peopling of the Americas is this giant, evolving puzzle that is still actively being pieced together. So what other secrets of our human origin remain hidden beneath the ice and the ocean, just waiting for the next breakthrough to bring them to the surface? Keep your eyes on the science, folks, because this cold case is really just getting warmed up.